The night Dinah's baby was born, the sky bled red. It wasn't the soft blush of evening or the warm glow of sunset. This was something else entirely, a crimson darkness that settled over Whitfield Plantation like a shroud, thick and oppressive, turning the tobacco fields into an ocean of shadows. The slaves working the late shift stopped mid-motion, hose suspended above the earth, eyes lifted toward a moon so swollen and scarlet it seemed ready to burst. "Blood moon," old Jeremiah muttered from his post near the well, his voice barely audible over the sudden, unnatural silence. "Ain't nothing good ever born under a blood moon?" In the quarters, a row of cramped wooden cabins that leaned against each other like exhausted travelers, Dinah screamed. She'd been laboring since dawn, her cries echoing across the plantation grounds until even Master Whitfield, ensconced in his grand house a quarter-mile away, heard them through his brandy-soaked stupor. But as the blood moon reached its zenith, her screams stopped, not gradually, not with the relief of birth. They simply ceased. Aunt Bess, the plantation's midwife for 30 years, pushed open the cabin door with trembling hands. "Tell me in the comments which country you are from and what you thought of this story. And if this story made an impression on you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future stories." Her face, normally the color of rich mahogany, had gone ashen. Behind her, 2 younger women, Sarah and Ruth, clutched at each other, their eyes wide with something beyond mere concern. "Go fetch the overseer," Aunt Bess whispered to no one in particular. Tell him Dinah's gone." The words spread through the quarters like smoke. Dinah, young, strong Dinah, who'd survived the Middle Passage as a child, who'd endured the lash, the sun, the endless brutality of cotton and tobacco, was dead. Dead in childbirth, like so many before her. Another body to bury in the slave cemetery beyond the South Field, another name for the whispered prayers at night. But it was what Aunt Bess said next that made the blood run cold. "The baby, Lord have mercy, the baby ain't right." Thomas Garrett, Whitfield's overseer, was a tall man with a face like carved granite and a disposition to match. He'd been managing slaves for 15 years, first in the Carolinas, then here in Hanover County, Virginia. He'd seen everything: runaways, rebellion, suicide. Nothing surprised him anymore, or so he thought. He stepped into Dinah's cabin with his lamp held high, its yellow light pushing weakly against the darkness. The air inside was thick, metallic, the smell of blood and something else, something he couldn't quite name. Fear, perhaps, or prophecy. Dinah lay on the narrow cot, her eyes still open, staring at nothing. Her hands were clutched against her chest, as if trying to hold something precious, even in death. Aunt Bess stood in the corner, her back pressed against the rough wooden wall. "Where's the child?" Garrett demanded. Aunt Bess didn't speak. She only lifted a shaking finger toward the far corner of the cabin, where a small bundle of cloth lay in a basket of straw. Garrett approached, his boots heavy on the dirt floor. He bent down, pulled back the cloth, and froze. The baby was perfectly formed. Healthy, even. Plump cheeks, strong limbs, skin the color of burnished copper. But his eyes, God in heaven, his eyes, they were open, wide open, staring directly at Garrett with an intensity that no newborn should possess, not blinking, not moving, just watching. "He ain't cried," Aunt Bess whispered from her corner. "Not once. Not when he came out, not when I cut the cord, not when his mama died right under him. He just looked." Garrett had seen enough. He straightened, his jaw tight. "Get him cleaned up. I'll inform the master in the morning. The mother gets buried tomorrow at dawn." "Mr. Garrett, sir," Aunt Bess's voice cracked. "There's something else." "What?" "When Dinah was dying, in her last moments, the baby, she swallowed hard. He pointed at her, lifted his hand right up and pointed like he knew, like he was showing us." Garrett's expression hardened. "Superstitious nonsense. The child's hand moved, that's all. Happens with newborns." But even as he said it, Even as he turned to leave, he felt it, a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. A sensation of being watched, measured, judged. He didn't look back at the basket. He should have. They buried Dinah at dawn, just as the blood moon finally surrendered to the pale light of morning. The ceremony was brief, a prayer mumbled by old Jeremiah, a handful of dirt thrown onto rough pine boards, a hymn sung so quietly it barely disturbed the air. Master Whitfield didn't attend. He never did for slave funerals, but his wife, Constance Whitfield, watched from the window of the main house, her pale face pressed against the glass. She was a delicate woman, prone to headaches and melancholy, with the kind of beauty that wilted in the Virginia heat. She'd been raised in Richmond society, educated in French and piano, utterly unprepared for the reality of plantation life. "The baby survived?" she asked her husband at breakfast, picking at her eggs with disinterest. "So I'm told," Whitfield replied, not looking up from his newspaper. "The overseer will decide what to do with it. Likely send it to the Johnson's place until he's old enough to work." "What was the mother's name? Does it matter?" Constance set down her fork, the delicate clink of silver against porcelain unnaturally loud. "I should like to see the child." Whitfield finally looked at her, his expression a mixture of annoyance and confusion. "Whatever for?" "Christian charity, Samuel. Surely even you understand the concept." He snorted but didn't argue. Constance so rarely expressed interest in anything that he was almost curious to see where this would lead. That afternoon, Aunt Bess brought the baby to the main house, wrapped in the cleanest cloth she could find. She climbed the back stairs — slaves never used the front entrance — and was ushered into the parlor, where Constance waited on a velvet settee. "Let me see him," Constance said softly. Aunt Bess approached, her movements careful, reverent almost. She pulled back the cloth. The baby stared up at Constance Whitfield with those same unblinking eyes, dark, fathomless, ancient. Constance gasped, but not from revulsion. From recognition, perhaps, though of what she couldn't say. She reached out one pale hand, her fingers trembling, and touched the baby's cheek. "He's beautiful," she whispered. "Yes, ma'am," Aunt Bess replied carefully. "He's special." "What will you name him?" "The overseer already named him, ma'am. Josiah." Josiah. Constance tested the name on her tongue. A prophet's name. How fitting! She pulled her hand back suddenly, as if burned. The baby's gaze never wavered, never left her face. And in that moment, Constance Whitfield felt something she'd never experienced before. The absolute certainty that she was in the presence of something far older and far more powerful than herself. "Take him," she said abruptly, standing. "Take him back to the quarters." "Yes, ma'am." As Aunt Bess turned to leave, Constance called out, "Bess?" "Ma'am." "Watch him closely. That child. He'll bring change to this place. I can feel it." "What kind of change, ma'am?" Constance walked to the window, looking out over the fields where dozens of slaves bent under the merciless sun. "The kind we're not ready for." 3 days later, the lightning came. It started as a summer storm, common enough in Virginia's humid Juness. Dark clouds gathered over the tobacco fields, thunder rumbling in the distance like cannon fire. The slaves were ordered to bring in the harvest before the rain hit, moving quickly between the rows, their fingers bleeding from the rough leaves. Josiah was in his basket in the quarters, under Aunt Bess's watch. She was mending a shirt when she noticed the baby's hand, such a tiny thing, barely bigger than a walnut, slowly rising from the blanket. His finger extended, pointing toward the window, toward the fields. "Lord, preserve us," Aunt Bess breathed. The lightning struck 3 seconds later. It hit the largest oak tree at the field's edge, where 5 men had taken shelter from the first drops of rain. The bolt was so bright it turned the world white, so loud it shook the foundations of every building on the plantation. The tree exploded, sending splinters the size of daggers in every direction. All 5 men died instantly. When Garrett and his men reached them, They found the bodies charred beyond recognition, their hands still clutching the tools they'd been holding. The smell of burned flesh hung in the air for days, mixing with the scent of rain-soaked earth and smouldering wood. Master Whitfield ordered the bodies buried immediately before word could spread. But word always spread on plantations. It moved through the quarters like wildfire, whispered in the dark, passed from cabin to cabin. The death child pointed. He knew they was gonna die. Dinah's baby, he ain't natural. And when Aunt Bess finally spoke of what she'd seen, the tiny hand rising, the finger extended, the perfect timing, no one doubted her. They'd all felt it. That morning Dinah died. They'd all seen those eyes. Old Jeremiah gathered a group of elders that night in his cabin. They sat in a circle, their faces grave in the candlelight, speaking in the hushed tones reserved for sacred things. The old stories talk of children like this, he said, his voice heavy with age and wisdom. Born in blood, touched by death. We had them back in Africa before the ships. We called them diviners. What do we do? Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Do we kill it? Kill a baby? Ruth hissed. Have you lost your mind? It ain't just a baby, another man argued. You saw what it did. It pointed, and they died. Maybe it was warning them, old Jeremiah said quietly. Maybe the child was trying to save them, and they didn't understand. Silence fell over the group. Or maybe, Jeremiah continued, his ancient eyes reflecting the candlelight, maybe death is tired of taking us in secret. Maybe it's time we saw it coming. The candle flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. In the quarters, in his basket, Josiah slept. His hand rested on his chest, fingers curled into a tiny fist. The summer of 1840 burned hotter than anyone could remember. The sun hung in the sky like a judge's gavel, merciless and absolute, turning the Virginia clay into something hard as bone. The slaves worked from dawn until dusk, their bodies moving through fields that shimmered with heat, while Master Whitfield retreated to his study with drawn curtains and cold compresses. Josiah was 3 months old. Aunt Bess kept him close, strapped to her back in a sling of worn cotton as she moved between her duties. The other slaves had begun to avoid him, crossing to the opposite side of the path when they saw her coming, making signs against evil when they thought she wasn't looking. But Bess refused to abandon the child. Someone had to care for him, and if the others were too frightened, then the responsibility fell to her. You ain't evil, she whispered to him one evening, rocking him gently in the cabin's dim light. You just different. The Lord works in mysterious ways, don't he? Josiah stared up at her with those dark, penetrating eyes, still never crying, still watching everything with an intensity that made her skin prickle. The fever started in the 3rd week of July. It came to the quarters like a thief, silent and sudden. Young Marcus, a field hand of 19, woke one morning with his body on fire, his skin slick with sweat, despite the early hour. By noon, he was delirious, crying out for his mother, who'd been sold away years before. By evening, 3 more had fallen ill. Garrett sent for the plantation doctor, a slovenly man named Hutchins, who smelled of whiskey and rarely washed his hands. He examined the sick with obvious distaste, his nose wrinkled against the smell of the quarters. Summer fever, he pronounced. Keep them isolated. Give them water. Some will live, most won't. That's the way of these things. Ah, can't you do nothing? Garrett demanded. We're losing workers. I can bleed them, Hutchins offered with a shrug. Might help, might not. You want me to try? Garrett looked at the 6 slaves, weighing the cost of treatment against their value. Do what you can. But the bleeding didn't help. If anything, it made things worse. By the end of the week, 12 were sick. By the end of the 2nd week, the first death came. Marcus died on a Tuesday, his body racked with convulsions, his final words a prayer in a language none of them recognized, something from across the ocean, perhaps, carried in his blood from ancestors he'd never known. Old Jeremiah wrapped him in burlap, and said the words, and they buried him in the red Virginia earth that had drunk so much of their sweat, and now their blood. That night, Aunt Bess was tending to the sick when she noticed Josiah had gone rigid in his sling. His eyes were fixed on something across the cabin, and slowly, terribly, his hand began to rise. "No," Bess whispered. "No, baby, don't." His finger extended, pointing at Sarah. Sarah had been helping distribute water, moving between the pallets where the sick lay moaning. She turned at the sound of Bess's voice, saw the baby's gesture, and her face went white. "He pointing at me," she said, her voice hollow. "Lord Jesus, he pointing at me." "It don't mean nothing," Bess said quickly, but her voice lacked conviction. "He just a baby, Sarah, just a baby." But they both knew better. Sarah fell ill the next morning. The fever took her fast, faster than the others, as if it had been waiting for permission. She was dead within 36 hours, her body consumed by the same violent convulsions that had taken Marcus. The quarters descended into panic. "The death child is marking us," someone whispered. "We got to do something," another hissed, "before he points at all of us." A delegation approached Garrett the next day. 5 of the strongest men, their hats literally in their hands, their eyes downcast in the practiced submission of the enslaved. "Sir," one of them began carefully. "It's about Dinah's baby." Garrett looked up from his ledger, his expression impatient. "What about it?" "The sickness, sir. It started after the lightning. And the baby, he points, sir. Before folks die, he points at them." Garrett's jaw tightened. "Are you telling me you believe a 3-month-old infant is causing this fever?" "We don't know what's causing it, sir. But the baby, he knows. He knows who's gonna die." "Sarah," the man's voice broke. "Sarah was my sister, sir." He pointed at her, "and then she died." "Superstitious nonsense," Garrett snapped, but something in his tone suggested uncertainty. He'd heard the stories, seen the way the slaves reacted to the child. And there had been those men under the oak tree. "Get back to work," he said finally, "and I don't want to hear any more talk about curses or omens. You understand?" "Yes, sir." But the talk didn't stop. It grew louder, more desperate, as the fever spread and the bodies piled up. 15 dead, then 20. The slave cemetery expanded into the cornfield, shallow graves carved into ground that had never known such a harvest. Constance Whitfield grew increasingly agitated as reports from the quarters reached the main house. She paced the parlor, her hands twisting in her skirts, her face pale and drawn. "We should send for a priest," she told her husband over supper. "A priest?" Whitfield looked at her as if she'd lost her mind. "What in God's name for?" "The child. The one I saw. There's something wrong about him, Samuel. Something unnatural. It's a baby, Constance. A slave baby at that. The fever is simply fever. These things happen. We'll lose some workers, buy more in the fall. That's the business." But Constance couldn't let it go. That night, she sent word to Richmond to her family's church, requesting that a minister come to Whitfield Plantation to perform what she called a spiritual cleansing. The Reverend Marcus Ainsworth arrived 3 days later. He was a severe man in his 50s, dressed entirely in black, with the kind of face that looked like it had never smiled. He carried a Bible bound in cracked leather and a leather case containing what he called his instruments of faith: holy water, blessed salt, a silver cross that had belonged to his grandfather. Garrett met him at the main house, skeptical but willing to humor the mistress's wishes if it would settle her nerves. "You understand," Ainsworth said as they walked toward the quarters, "that I do not typically involve myself in the affairs of these people." But Mrs. Whitfield was quite insistent, and the symptoms she described suggest something beyond mere illness. "You think it's the devil?" Garrett asked, not bothering to hide his scorn. "I think," Ainsworth replied carefully, "that evil takes many forms, and sometimes those forms are hidden in the most innocent vessels. They found Josiah in Aunt Bess's cabin. She'd been up all night tending to the sick and had finally collapsed into an exhausted sleep, the baby cradled against her chest. Ainsworth approached slowly, his boots loud on the wooden floor. He stared down at the child, his expression unreadable. Josiah's eyes opened. For a long moment, the Reverend and the child simply looked at each other, a staring contest across an impossible divide of age, race, and understanding. Then Ainsworth pulled out his Bible. "In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit," he began, his voice rising, "I command any unclean spirit dwelling in this child to depart." Josiah's hand rose, slowly, deliberately, his finger extended, pointing directly at Reverend Marcus Ainsworth. The Reverend's words died in his throat. His face went from red to white in the space of a heartbeat. The Bible slipped from his fingers, hitting the floor with a sound like a gunshot. "No," he whispered. Garrett stepped forward. "Reverend!" But Ainsworth was already backing away, his eyes never leaving the baby's pointing finger. "I have to go," he said, his voice high and strange. "I have to go now." "The ceremony? There is no ceremony!" Ainsworth nearly shouted. "That child is not possessed. He is something else, something older. I want no part of it." He fled the cabin, nearly running, his black coat flapping behind him like broken wings. Garrett followed, confused and increasingly alarmed. "Reverend Ainsworth, wait!" But the Reverend was already mounting his horse, his hands shaking so badly he could barely grip the reins. "Tell Mrs. Whitfield I'm sorry," he said. "Tell her to pray. Tell her—" He stopped, his face twisted with something between terror and awe. "Tell her that some doors once opened cannot be closed." He spurred his horse and was gone, leaving a cloud of dust and a dozen unanswered questions. Garrett stood in the yard, watching him disappear down the road. Behind him, he could hear the sounds of the quarters, moaning, praying, the desperate whispers of those who knew death was coming and could do nothing to stop it. He turned back toward Bess's cabin. Through the open door, he could see the baby, still in his basket, his hand slowly lowering back to his chest. And Garrett knew, with a certainty that chilled his bones, that Reverend Ainsworth was going to die. The Reverend made it 15 miles before his horse stumbled. The animal's leg caught in a gopher hole, and Ainsworth was thrown, his body hitting the hard-packed road with a sickening crack. His neck broke on impact. They found him at sunset, his eyes wide open, staring at nothing, one hand still clutching his Bible. Word reached the plantation the next morning. No one spoke. They didn't need to. They all knew. They'd all seen the baby point. That afternoon, as the sun beat down mercilessly on the fever-racked quarters, Master Whitfield summoned Garrett to his study. "I want that child gone," he said without preamble. "Sir?" "The baby, Dinah's baby. I don't care where you take him or what you do with him, but I want him off this plantation by tomorrow. The slaves are in revolt. They won't work, won't eat, just sit there praying and wailing. And now this business with the Reverend—" He poured himself a generous glass of brandy. "I won't have it. I won't have my property destroyed by superstition and fear." "What about Mrs. Whitfield?" "My wife," Whitfield said coldly, "is confined to her room with laudanum and will not be consulted on matters of plantation management. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir, but where—" "The Johnsons have a place near the swamp. They take difficult cases, children no one else wants. Take him there. Pay them whatever they ask. Just get him away from here." Garrett nodded slowly. "And if the baby, if something happens on the way," Whitfield met his eyes, "then that would be God's will, wouldn't it?" They prepared to move Josiah at dawn. Aunt Bess wrapped him carefully, her face wet with tears, whispering prayers over his small body. "I'm sorry, baby," she murmured. "I'm so sorry. I tried to protect you, but they too scared. They all too scared." Old Jeremiah came to see him off, his ancient face grave. He placed one weathered hand on the baby's forehead, closed his eyes, and spoke in that language none of them knew anymore, the tongue of their ancestors, carried across the ocean in chains, but never quite forgotten. "What you saying?" Bess asked. "I'm asking the spirits to watch over him," Jeremiah replied, "and I'm asking them to forgive us for being too weak to understand, too scared to see." "See what?" Jeremiah looked at her, his eyes full of sorrow and wisdom. "That death ain't the enemy, Bess, it's just the messenger, and we've been killing the messenger since the day we got here." Garrett appeared in the doorway, his face hard. "It's time." Bess handed over the baby, her arms suddenly empty, her heart breaking. Josiah looked up at her one last time, those dark eyes holding hers, and for just a moment, just one brief, impossible moment, she thought she saw him smile. Then Garrett turned away, carrying the child toward a wagon waiting in the yard, and Bess fell to her knees, sobbing. The wagon rolled away as the sun rose, heading south toward the swamp and whatever waited there. In the back, wrapped in old blankets, Josiah lay quiet and still. His hand was tucked against his chest. The road to the Johnson place wound through territory that seemed to exist outside of time. The cultivated fields of Whitfield Plantation gave way gradually to scrub pine and wild grass, and then, as the miles accumulated, to something darker and older, the great Virginia swamp that locals whispered about but rarely entered. Garrett drove the wagon himself, unwilling to involve any of the other slaves in what felt increasingly like a cursed errand. Beside him sat Solomon, an older slave who knew the roads better than anyone, his face impassive as they bounced along the rutted path. In the back, Josiah lay in his basket, eyes open, watching the canopy of trees slide past overhead. "How much further?" Garrett asked as the sun climbed toward noon. "Another hour, maybe less," Solomon replied. His voice was careful, neutral. "You been to the Johnson place before, Mr. Garrett?" "No. It ain't like other places." Garrett shot him a look. "Meaning?" Solomon was quiet for a moment, choosing his words. "Meaning the Johnsons, they take children nobody else wants. One's born wrong or marked or different. They say Martha Johnson was a slave herself once before she got freed. Say she knows things, old things." "More superstition," Garrett muttered, but there was no conviction in his voice. The trees grew thicker, their branches intertwining overhead until the road became a tunnel of green shadow. Spanish moss hung in grey veils, and the air grew heavy with moisture and the smell of decay. Somewhere in the distance, they could hear water moving slowly and the occasional splash of something large entering it. "There," Solomon said, pointing. Through the trees, a house emerged, or rather, a structure that might once have been a house, but had been swallowed slowly by the swamp around it. It sat on stilts above the dark water, its wood weathered to silver grey, its roof patched with mismatched shingles and what looked like tin sheets. Smoke rose from a crooked chimney, and on the porch, half hidden in shadow, sat a figure. Garrett brought the wagon to a stop at the edge of the dry ground. His hand moved instinctively to the pistol at his belt, a gesture Solomon noted but didn't comment on. "Hello, the house," Garrett called out. The figure on the porch stood. As she stepped into the light, Garrett saw a woman of indeterminate age. She could have been 40 or 60, her face lined but strong, her hair wrapped in a faded red cloth. Her dress was simple homespun, but around her neck hung what looked like a collection of bones, feathers, and stones on a leather cord. "Martha Johnson. You from Whitfield Place," she said. Not a question. Her voice was deep, musical, with an accent Garrett couldn't place. Something that mixed Virginia drawl with something older, something that had crossed the ocean. "I am. I've brought. I know what you brought." Martha's eyes moved to the basket in the wagon bed. "The death child." Garrett felt his skin prickle. "His name is Josiah. He got many names. Josiah just the one white men gave him." She descended the porch steps, her bare feet making no sound on the weathered wood. Bring him inside. We talk price after." Solomon helped Garrett carry the basket up the precarious steps and into the house. Inside was dim and smoky, lit by candles and what filtered through gaps in the walls. The single room was crowded with things. Bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, jars filled with substances Garrett didn't want to identify, symbols drawn on the walls in what looked like charcoal or blood, and children. They emerged from the shadows like ghosts, 5 of them, ranging in age from perhaps 3 to 12. None of them spoke. One, a girl of about 7, had eyes that didn't track together. Another boy's skin was mottled with birthmarks that covered half his face. A third child rocked back and forth constantly, humming a tuneless song. The unwanted, the different, the ones no plantation would keep. Martha gestured to a table in the center of the room. "Put him there." Garrett set down the basket, stepping back quickly. Martha approached slowly, her eyes never leaving the baby. She reached out one gnarled hand and touched his forehead, his chest, his small hands. Josiah stared up at her. "You feel it?" she asked softly. "The weight of him? This ain't no ordinary child. This is something the old gods sent." "The old gods are dead," Garrett said, but his voice was uncertain. Martha smiled, showing teeth filed to points in a pattern Garrett had seen only once before, on a slave fresh off the ships from Benin. "Dead?" "No, sir. Just sleeping, waiting. And when they wake..." She looked down at Josiah. "They send messengers first, to prepare the way." "I don't care about your pagan beliefs," Garrett said harshly, trying to regain control of the situation. "Master Whitfield will pay you $50 to keep the child." $50, Mrs. Johnson. "That's more than generous." $50, Martha repeated, amused. "You think that's what this costs, to take in death itself? Then name your price." Martha was silent for a long time, her hand still resting on Josiah's chest. The other children had gathered around, staring at the baby with expressions that ranged from curiosity to fear. $100, she said finally. $100 and supplies, food, medicine, cloth. And you tell your master something for me." "What?" "You tell him the child ain't the curse, the plantation is, built on blood, watered with tears, harvested with death. The child just shows you what was always there. You can run him away, hide him in the swamp, but the truth don't change." She looked up at Garrett, her eyes hard as stone. "The truth never changes." Garrett wanted to argue, to dismiss her words as the ravings of an ignorant woman. But standing in that strange house, surrounded by those silent children, with Josiah's unblinking eyes watching him, he found he couldn't. "I'll bring the money tomorrow," he said, "and the supplies." "You do that." Martha lifted Josiah from the basket, cradling him against her chest with surprising gentleness. "Go on now, before the swamp decides to keep you." Garrett didn't need to be told twice. He and Solomon left quickly, the wagon rattling back down the road at twice the speed they'd arrived. Neither man spoke until they were clear of the trees and back into the sunlight of the open fields. "You believe what she said?" Solomon asked finally. "About the child being sent by the old gods?" Garrett didn't answer. He didn't want to. Because the truth was, after everything he'd seen, the lightning, the fever, the reverend's death, he was beginning to believe in things he'd never thought possible. Martha Johnson raised Josiah for 5 years in that house above the swamp. She taught him to walk, to speak, though he rarely did, to navigate the treacherous paths through the water. The other children were wary of him at first, but gradually they came to accept his presence, and the pointing continued. Martha kept records in a leather-bound book, noting each time Josiah's hand rose, each time his finger extended. She tracked who he pointed at, always through the walls, always in the direction of the Whitfield Plantation or the town beyond, and she noted when news came of deaths. He was never wrong. Not once. The pattern became clear. Josiah would point, sometimes days in advance, sometimes only hours, and death would follow. Not always violent death. Sometimes it was illness, sometimes age, sometimes simple accident. But it always came. "You see something the rest of us don't," Martha told him one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the swamp. "Something in the fabric of things, the threads that hold life together, and when they're about to break." Josiah, now 5 years old, looked at her with those same dark, ancient eyes he'd been born with. "Why me?" His voice was quiet, rarely used. "I don't know, child. Maybe because you was born under the blood moon. Maybe because your mama died bringing you into this world. Maybe because the spirits needed a witness." She put her arm around his thin shoulders. "But I know this. It ain't a curse. It's a gift, even if nobody else can see it that way. They hate me. They fear you. There's a difference. Is there?" Martha had no answer for that. The supplies came every month, brought by Solomon in a wagon loaded with food, cloth, and the money Martha demanded. He never spoke of what happened at the plantation, and Martha never asked, but she could see it in his face. The weariness, the grief, the slow grinding down of the human spirit under the weight of bondage. Sometimes he would linger, sitting on the porch with a cup of water, watching the swamp. "How's the child?" he asked one day. "Growing, learning. Does he still point?" "Yes." Solomon nodded slowly. "People at the plantation, they think getting rid of him broke the curse. But it didn't, did it? The dying just continued. Different people, same death." "The child ain't causing it," Martha said patiently. "He's just showing it to you. You can close your eyes, but that don't make the truth disappear." Master Whitfield don't believe that. He thinks the child was cursed, that removing him saved the plantation. "Then Master Whitfield is a fool." They sat in silence, listening to the sounds of the swamp, the buzz of insects, the call of birds, the slow movement of water. "There's talk," Solomon said finally, "in town, about abolitionists, about rebellion. Some say war is coming." "War always coming," Martha replied. "Just a question of when. And the child? What happens to him when war comes?" Martha looked through the open door to where Josiah sat with the other children, watching them play a game with stones. He didn't participate, and he never did, but he watched with that intense focus that made him seem so much older than his years. "The child will survive," she said. "He always does. Death takes everyone around him, but death can't take death itself." Solomon stood to leave, then hesitated. "Mrs. Johnson." "Yes?" "If he points at me, would you tell me?" Martha met his eyes, saw the exhaustion there, the quiet desperation of a man who'd lived too long under the yoke. "Would you want to know?" Yes, I think I would. At least then I'd know it was ending." Martha nodded slowly. "Then I'll tell you." But as Solomon climbed back into his wagon and started down the road, Martha hoped that day would never come, because, despite everything, despite the pointing and the death and the fear, she'd grown fond of the old man. And she knew Josiah had too. By 1845, Josiah was 10 years old, and the world was changing. Tensions between North and South had escalated. The question of slavery divided families, churches, entire states. In Richmond, abolitionists printed pamphlets that were smuggled onto plantations, teaching slaves to read, filling their heads with dangerous ideas about freedom and dignity. Meanwhile, slave catchers grew bolder, their methods more brutal, determined to crush any hint of resistance before it could spread. At Whitfield Plantation, Master Samuel Whitfield's health had begun to fail. The man who'd once ruled his property with an iron fist now spent most days in his study, drinking heavily, while Garrett effectively ran the estate. Constance Whitfield had retreated further into her melancholy, spending hours staring out windows, talking to ghosts only she could see. The slaves whispered that the plantation was cursed, that the spirits of those who died demanded justice. Productivity dropped. Accidents increased. 3 times that year, slaves disappeared into the night, fleeing north toward what they called the drinking gourd. the stars that would lead them to freedom. And through it all, in his house above the swamp, Josiah watched. He was different from the other children Martha cared for. While they played and laughed and cried like normal children, Josiah remained apart, his eyes always distant, as if seeing through the present moment into something beyond. He spoke rarely, and when he did, his words carried a weight that made even Martha uncomfortable. "Something's coming," he told her one evening as they sat on the porch. "Something always coming, child." "No." His voice was certain, final. "Something big. Something that's going to change everything." Martha felt a chill, despite the humid warmth of the evening. "You see it? In your visions?" "I don't have visions. I just know. The same way I know when someone's going to die." He turned to look at her, his face serious. "And I know that soon everyone at the plantation is going to die. Everyone. Everyone who's guilty." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Martha wanted to dismiss them as the imagination of a strange child, but she knew better. Josiah had never been wrong, not once in 10 years. "When?" she asked quietly. "Soon. Maybe days, maybe weeks, but soon." That night Martha wrote a letter to Solomon. She rarely put things in writing. It was too dangerous for a black woman, even a free one, to be caught with literacy. But this was important enough to risk it. She told him to run. She told him to take anyone he could, anyone who would listen, and run north. Run as far and as fast as possible, because death was coming to Whitfield Plantation, and this time no one would be spared. Solomon received the letter on a Tuesday. He burned it immediately, but the words stayed with him, etched into his mind like scars. That night, he gathered a small group in his cabin, the ones he trusted, the ones who were strong enough and desperate enough to risk everything. "We leaving," he told them simply, "tonight." "Where we going?" asked Ruth, Sarah's sister, who'd survived the fever. "North, as far as we can get before they catch us." "They'll kill us if they catch us," someone said. "They'll kill us if we stay," Solomon replied. "At least running, we got a chance." But not everyone could run. Some were too old, too sick, too afraid. Others had children too young to make the journey, or family members they refused to leave behind. In the end, only 7 agreed to go, 7 out of nearly 60 slaves on the plantation. They left at midnight, taking nothing but the clothes on their backs and what little food they could steal from the kitchen. Solomon led them through the fields, past the slave cemetery where so many of their friends and family lay, and into the forest beyond. Behind them, Whitfield Plantation slept, unaware that anything had changed. But Josiah knew. In his house above the swamp, he sat up suddenly, his eyes wide in the darkness. Martha, sleeping in the next room, heard him and came to his side. "What is it, child?" "They're running," he whispered. "Solomon and the others. They're running north." "That's good." "They'll be safe." "No!" Josiah's voice was flat, certain. "They won't. The catchers will find them before they reach the border. 3 of them will die. The rest will be brought back." Martha's heart sank. "You sure?" "I'm always sure." And he was right. The slave catchers found them on the 3rd day, just as they crossed into Maryland. They'd been betrayed by a farmer who'd promised to hide them, but instead sent word to the authorities for the reward money. The chase was brutal and swift. Dogs tore through the forest, their barking echoing through the trees like the howls of demons. Men on horseback followed, carrying rifles and whips and the absolute certainty of their righteousness. Solomon heard them coming and made a decision. He told the others to scatter, to run in different directions, hoping that some might escape while the catchers were divided. He stayed behind to give them time. The catchers found him standing in a clearing, unarmed, his hands raised. He was 63 years old, and he was tired, so very tired of running, of hiding, of living half a life in someone else's shadow. "You coming quiet?" the lead catcher asked, his rifle pointed at Solomon's chest. "I'm coming," Solomon replied, "but I ain't going quiet." He told them what he thought of them. He told them what he thought of their laws, their God, their civilization built on stolen lives and broken backs. He told them everything he'd held inside for 6 decades, every curse and prayer and scream that had been swallowed down in the name of survival. They beat him for it. They beat him until his face was unrecognizable, until his ribs cracked, until blood pooled in his lungs. And when they were done, when their arms were tired and their rage was spent, they tied him to a horse and dragged him back toward the plantation. Solomon died somewhere along the road, his body bouncing over roots and stones, his spirit finally mercifully set free. The other 4 who were caught, including Ruth, were brought back alive but broken. The 3 who escaped kept running, disappearing into the network of safe houses and secret routes that would later be called the Underground Railroad. When the catchers arrived at Whitfield Plantation with Solomon's body and the recaptured slaves, Garrett felt something inside him shift. He'd seen death before, had even ordered it, but something about Solomon's ruined face, about the way his dead eyes stared at nothing, made him feel sick. Master Whitfield was delighted. "String them up," he ordered, pointing at the 4 survivors. "String them up in the center of the quarters where everyone can see. Leave them there for 3 days. Let it be a lesson." "Sir," Garrett began, but Whitfield cut him off. "Are you questioning me?" "No, sir, but—" "Then do as I say, and find out who else was planning to run. I want names, Garrett. I want every slave who even thought about escaping to understand what happens when they defy me." That night, as Ruth and the others hung from makeshift gallows, their bodies swaying in the humid breeze, the slaves gathered in their cabins and prayed. They prayed for the dead. They prayed for the living. And some of them, in whispers so quiet even the wind couldn't hear, prayed for vengeance. In the swamp, Josiah stood on the porch, staring north toward the plantation he could not see. His hand was raised, his finger extended, but this time he wasn't pointing at one person. He was pointing at all of them. "It's time," he told Martha. "Time for what, child?" "Time for judgment." The sickness came first. It wasn't the fever from years before. This was something new. Something that struck without warning and killed without mercy. Master Whitfield fell ill on a Monday, his body racked with pain so intense he couldn't even scream. The doctor came, examined him, and found nothing. No rash, no fever, no obvious cause. But Whitfield was dying anyway. Constance found him in his study, collapsed over his desk, blood running from his nose and mouth. She tried to call for help, but her voice wouldn't work. And then she looked down and saw her own hands were shaking. Her own vision was blurring. The sickness had her too. By Wednesday, half the house staff was dead. By Friday, the disease had spread to the quarters, but strangely, it was selective. It took the overseers, the drivers, the slaves who'd cooperated with the masters. It took those who'd informed on the runners, who'd betrayed their own for small favors, but it spared the innocent. Garrett watched in horror as his world collapsed. He sent for doctors from Richmond, from Charlottesville, from as far away as Baltimore. They came, examined the dying, and left with no answers and a healthy fear of whatever was killing an entire plantation. "It's the water," one said. "It's the air," said another. "It's judgment," old Jeremiah whispered, and for once no one argued. On the 7th day, Garrett made a decision. He had the wagon hitched, loaded it with supplies, and started toward the swamp. If this was judgment, if this was somehow connected to that child they'd sent away years before, then perhaps he could bargain. Perhaps he could make it stop. He found Martha's house just as the sun was setting. She was sitting on the porch, as if she'd been expecting him. "Too late," she said as he climbed down from the wagon. "Please," Garrett said, and he was ashamed to hear his voice break. "Please, whatever this is, make it stop. I'll do anything. Pay anything. Ain't about payment." Martha stood, walking to the edge of the porch. This about justice, about all those years of suffering, all those deaths you never paid for. You thought you could send the messenger away and the message would disappear, but truth don't work that way. I'll free them, Garrett said desperately. All of them. I'll write the papers myself. Just stop this. Martha shook her head slowly. Too late for that too. The wheel's already turning, Mr. Garrett. Can't stop it now. Behind her, Josiah emerged from the house. He was 10 years old, but moved with the gravity of something ancient. His eyes found Garrett's, and the overseer felt his breath catch in his throat. You remember me, Josiah said. Not a question. Yes. You took me from my people, said I was cursed, said I was bringing death. We were wrong, Garrett whispered. God help us. We were wrong. No. Josiah's voice was gentle, almost pitying. You were right. I do bring death, but only to those who deserve it, only to those who build their kingdoms on bones and call it civilization. He raised his hand, his finger extended, pointing directly at Garrett. The overseer felt something inside him crack. Not his body, but something deeper, his soul, perhaps, whatever made him human. How long? He asked. 3 days, Josiah replied, maybe less. Garrett nodded slowly. There was a strange relief in it, in finally knowing. He climbed back into his wagon, turned it around, and headed back toward the plantation. He didn't hurry. There was no point. Behind him, Martha put her hand on Josiah's shoulder. Was that necessary? It was justice. Justice and mercy ain't the same thing, child. I know. Josiah lowered his hand. But mercy is for those who show it. And they never did. Thomas Garrett died on the 3rd day, exactly as Josiah had predicted. His body was found in the slave quarters, where he'd gone to try to help those who were sick. It was, some said, the only decent thing he'd ever done. Master Whitfield lasted another week, delirious and screaming, seeing ghosts in every shadow. He died calling out for his mother, for forgiveness, for God. No one answered. Constance Whitfield survived, but barely. The sickness left her body but took her mind. She spent her remaining years in an asylum in Richmond, drawing pictures of a small black child with his finger pointing at her, over and over, until the day she died. By the end of the month, 23 people were dead, all of them white, or slaves who'd actively cooperated in the oppression of their own people. The innocent, those who'd simply tried to survive, who'd protected each other, who'd kept their humanity in an inhuman system, survived. The plantation was sold at auction. The remaining slaves were freed by court order when no heir could be found to claim the property. They scattered, some heading north, others west, carrying with them stories of the death child who'd brought justice to Whitfield Plantation. By 1861, America was tearing itself apart. The first shots at Fort Sumter echoed across a divided nation, and suddenly the whispers of war became screams. Young men marched away in uniform, believing they'd be home by Christmas. They weren't. Most of them would never come home at all. Josiah was 16 now, taller but still thin, with those same dark eyes that seemed to see through time itself. Martha Johnson had aged significantly. The swamp life was hard, and the years had taken their toll. But she'd raised him as best she could, along with the other unwanted children who'd found their way to her door. You should go north, she told him one evening, as they sat watching the sunset paint the swamp water red. Find your freedom while you can. War's coming here soon. I know, Josiah replied. I've seen it. Then why stay? Because there are things I need to witness, things I need to record. Martha looked at him curiously. Over the years, she'd watched him develop habits that were unusual even for him. He kept journals, carefully hidden, meticulously maintained, where he wrote down every pointing, every death, every vision. She didn't know why, didn't ask. Some questions had no good answers. You can't save them, you know, she said gently. The soldiers, the slaves, whoever. You can't change what's coming. I'm not trying to save them. I'm just bearing witness. He turned to look at her, and for a moment his ancient eyes were just those of a 16-year-old boy. Someone has to remember, someone has to write it down. Otherwise, it's like they never existed at all. The war reached Virginia in earnest by 1862. Battles scarred the landscape. Bull Run, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville. The names would become legendary, synonymous with blood and suffering. And through it all, Josiah watched. He moved through the war zones like a ghost. Sometimes he traveled with escaped slaves heading north, sometimes with Union troops, sometimes alone. No one questioned him too closely. A young black man in the chaos of war was hardly unusual. And there was something about him, something in his eyes, that made people uncomfortable. They were happy to let him pass without inquiry. He witnessed the Battle of Antietam, the bloodiest single day in American history, 17,000 casualties in 12 hours. He stood on a ridge overlooking the cornfield, where Union and Confederate soldiers slaughtered each other in neat rows, and he pointed. Not at individuals, there were too many, but at sections, at groups, at the places where death would harvest most heavily. A Union officer found him there, a young lieutenant from Massachusetts named William Bradford. "What are you doing, boy?" Bradford demanded. "Counting," Josiah replied. "Counting what?" "The dead." Bradford looked at him strangely, then followed his gaze to the cornfield. The battle was still raging, smoke and noise obscuring everything. "How can you count them? You can't even see them." "I don't need to see them," Josiah said. "I can feel them. Every soul that leaves, it makes a mark like ripples on water." Bradford should have dismissed this as superstitious nonsense, should have ordered the strange young man away. But something made him stay, something made him watch as Josiah's hand moved across the landscape, pointing here, then there, then there. And everywhere he pointed, the firing intensified, the screaming grew louder, and when the smoke cleared, the bodies lay in heaps. "Jesus Christ," Bradford whispered. "He can't help them now," Josiah said quietly. Maybe he never could. Bradford survived Antietam, but barely. He was wounded at Fredericksburg and sent home to recover. Before he left, he found Josiah again, in a field hospital where the boy was helping tend to the wounded. "I need to know," Bradford said. Are you human?" Josiah looked up from the man whose wounds he was binding. "What do you think?" "I think you're something else, something I don't understand." "Does it matter?" Bradford considered this. "I suppose not. But tell me one thing. Why do you help them, the wounded? If you can see death coming, why try to stop it?" "I'm not stopping it," Josiah replied. "I'm just making sure they don't die alone." "There's a difference." Bradford left Virginia 2 days later. He would survive the war, return to Massachusetts, and spend the rest of his life trying to forget what he'd seen. But he never could. In his dreams, he always saw the same thing. A young black man with ancient eyes, pointing at death, counting the cost of freedom. In 1863, Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. On paper, slavery was ended in the Confederate States. In reality, the war raged on, and freedom remained a distant promise. Josiah found himself in Tennessee, attached to a regiment of newly freed slaves who joined the Union Army. They called themselves the United States Colored Troops, and they fought with a ferocity born of centuries of oppression, finally given an outlet. Among them was a man named Elijah, 40 years old, who'd been a slave on a cotton plantation in Alabama before escaping north. He joined the army not just to fight the Confederacy, but to free his wife and children, who were still enslaved somewhere in Georgia. "You think we'll win?" Elijah asked Josiah one night as they sat around a campfire. "Yes. You sound certain." "I am." "How do you know?" Josiah was quiet for a moment, staring into the flames. "Because I've seen it. I've seen Lee surrender. I've seen the Union restored. I've seen slavery end, legally and completely." Elijah leaned forward, his eyes intense. "And my family? Do I find them?" Josiah met his gaze, and what Elijah saw there made his breath catch. Pity, sorrow, grief. "No," Josiah said softly. "I'm sorry." Elijah's face crumbled. "How do you know?" Maybe. I know. Josiah's voice was gentle but firm. Your wife dies of pneumonia next winter. Your children were sold to a plantation in Mississippi. By the time you find them, they won't remember you. They'll have new names, new lives. They won't want to leave. You're lying. But there was no conviction in Elijah's voice. I wish I was. Elijah stood abruptly, walking away into the darkness. Josiah let him go. What comfort could he offer? The truth was the truth, no matter how it hurt. But the next morning, Elijah was back, his face set with determination. If I can't save them, he said, then I'll fight so other men can save their families. That's something, ain't it? That's everything, Josiah replied. Elijah died 3 months later at the Battle of Nashville, shot through the chest while charging a Confederate position. He died believing he'd failed. But the truth was, his sacrifice, and the sacrifice of thousands like him, would change the course of history. Josiah made sure to record his name in the journals. Someone needed to remember. The war ended in April 1865 with Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. The news spread across the South like wildfire. Some greeted it with joy, others with despair, most with a weary relief that the killing was finally over. Josiah was in Virginia when he heard. He'd returned to the area around Whitfield Plantation, drawn by something he couldn't explain. The plantation itself was in ruins, burned during the war, the fields overgrown, the great house nothing but a skeleton of charred timbers. He stood in what had once been the slave quarters, now just foundations and memories. This was where his mother had died. This was where he'd been born under a blood moon. This was where everything had started. You came back, a voice said behind him. Josiah turned. Martha Johnson stood there, older and frailer than he remembered, but still standing, still alive. Martha. He crossed the distance between them, embracing her gently. I thought that I'd be dead by now. She laughed, a dry sound like wind through dead leaves. Probably should be, but I'm stubborn, wanted to see the end of it all, wanted to see freedom come. It's here, Josiah said. The war's over. We won. Did we? Martha looked around at the ruins. Lot of death for freedom, and I suspect there's more dying to come. Different kind, maybe, but just as certain. She was right, of course. Josiah had seen it, the Reconstruction, the Jim Crow laws, the lynchings and terror that would follow. Freedom on paper wasn't the same as freedom in fact. Why did you come back? Martha asked. I don't know. Maybe to remember, maybe to say goodbye. To the dead. To all of it, this place, this time, my childhood. He looked down at his hands, no longer small, no longer the hands of a child who pointed at death. I'm 20 now, Martha, an adult. And I still don't understand why I am the way I am, why I see what I see. Martha took his hands in hers. Maybe you ain't supposed to understand. Maybe you just supposed to witness, to remember, to make sure that all these people who died, all this suffering, it meant something. And if it doesn't, if we just trade one kind of oppression for another, then you keep witnessing, you keep recording, you keep telling the truth even when nobody wants to hear it. She squeezed his hands. That's the burden you carry, child. Not death, truth. They stood together in the ruins as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of red and gold. And in that moment, Josiah understood something he'd been too young to grasp before. He didn't bring death. He revealed it. There was a difference. 20 years passed. The Reconstruction era came and went, leaving behind broken promises and resurgent racism. The freed slaves discovered that legal freedom and actual freedom were very different things. Sharecropping replaced slavery, keeping black families in poverty and debt. The Ku Klux Klan rose to terrorize anyone who dared to claim their rights. And slowly, inexorably, the gains of the war were rolled back. Josiah witnessed it all. He traveled extensively, documenting the lives of freed slaves, recording their stories, their struggles, their small victories, and crushing defeats. He'd become something of a legend in certain circles, a strange, ageless man who appeared at moments of crisis, who knew when death was coming, who wrote everything down in journals that he kept hidden and safe. He was 40 now, though he looked younger. Perhaps it was his gift or his curse that kept him preserved while others aged. Or perhaps he simply carried so much death within him that there was no room for his own mortality. Martha Johnson had died in 1872, peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by the children she'd cared for over the decades. Josiah was there when it happened. For once, he didn't need to point. He simply sat beside her, holding her hand as she took her last breath. "You going to be all right?" she'd asked him, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know," he'd answered honestly. "You will be. You're stronger than you think, and your work ain't done yet." "What work?" she smiled. "Bearing witness. Telling the truth, making sure they don't forget." Those were her last words. Josiah buried her next to her house in the swamp, under a cypress tree that had stood for 200 years and would stand for 200 more. He carved her name into the bark himself, Martha Johnson, 1805–1872, mother to the unwanted. By 1885, Josiah found himself back in Virginia, in Richmond. The city had changed, rebuilt after the war, growing and modernizing, trying to forget the bloodshed that had soaked its streets. But the past had a way of lingering, especially for those who could see it. He'd been drawn to Richmond by rumors of a trial. A black man named Samuel Williams had been accused of assaulting a white woman, an accusation that everyone knew was false, but that would likely result in a lynching before any court could convene. Josiah arrived on a hot August evening. The streets were crowded with people, white and black alike, all heading toward the jail where Williams was being held. The air crackled with tension, violence barely held in check. He found a spot on the edge of the crowd, watching, listening. "String him up!" someone shouted. "Burn him!" another voice added. The mob mentality was building, that terrible collective insanity where individuals surrendered their humanity to become part of something darker. Josiah had seen it before, too many times. He knew how this would end, unless it didn't. He pushed through the crowd, moving toward the jail. People stepped aside without quite knowing why, repelled by something they couldn't name. He reached the doors just as they were being broken down, just as the mob was surging forward. And he raised his hand, not pointing at one person, not pointing at a section or a group, pointing at everyone. The mob stopped. It was as if time itself had frozen. Hundreds of people caught mid-motion, their faces twisted with hate and rage, suddenly unable to move, unable to breathe, unable to do anything but stare at the strange man with the ancient eyes who stood before them. "You want to kill him?" Josiah said, his voice quiet but somehow carrying to every ear. "You want to murder a man for something he didn't do, because it makes you feel powerful, because it lets you forget for a moment how powerless you really are." "Who the hell are you?" someone managed to ask. "I'm the one who's been watching. For 45 years I've been watching. I watched you build your civilization on bones. I watched you go to war to keep your power. I watched you lose that war, and then spend 20 years trying to pretend you won." He lowered his hand slightly, and the crowd gasped as movement returned to their bodies. But they didn't surge forward. Something held them back. Fear, perhaps, or the first stirrings of shame. "I can see death," Josiah continued. "I've always been able to see it, and right now I see all of you. I see when you'll die, and how, and what you'll regret in your final moments. And you know what I see most often? Silence. I see people who died having done nothing good, nothing meaningful, just lived and hurt others and died and were forgotten." He walked forward, and the crowd parted like water. He climbed the steps of the jail, turned, and looked back at them. "Samuel Williams is innocent. You all know it. And if you kill him, his blood will be on your hands. Not just his blood, the blood of everyone you've ever lynched, every life you've destroyed out of fear and ignorance and hate." "You can't stop us," someone called out, but the voice was uncertain. "I'm not stopping you," Josiah replied. "You're free to do whatever you want, but know this, I'm writing it down. Every name, every face, every person who participates in this murder. And your children, and your children's children, they'll know what you did. They'll know what kind of people you were." He pulled out one of his journals, opened it to a blank page, and began to write. The scratching of his pen was the only sound in the suddenly quiet street. The mob stood frozen, not by any supernatural power, but by something far more mundane: conscience. The awareness that their actions had consequences, that history would judge them. One by one, people began to leave. First in ones and twos, then in larger groups, until the street was nearly empty. The crisis had passed. Samuel Williams was released the next morning, charges dropped. He left Virginia immediately, heading north, and lived to be 73 years old. He never forgot the strange man who'd saved his life, though he never learned his name. The incident in Richmond marked a turning point for Josiah. He realized that his gift wasn't just about seeing death, it was about preventing it when he chose to, about using the fear that death inspired to change behavior, to save lives. He began to travel more deliberately, seeking out moments of potential violence, lynchings, riots, attacks. Wherever death threatened the innocent, he appeared. Sometimes his presence alone was enough. Other times he had to point, had to remind people of their mortality, to make them see the cost of their actions. He saved dozens, maybe hundreds. He lost count after a while, but the work took its toll. By 1900, Josiah was 55 years old, and he was tired, so very tired. He'd spent his entire life in the shadow of death, watching it, recording it, sometimes preventing it, but he'd never lived. Never had friends, never had love, never had anything resembling a normal life. He returned to the swamp, to the ruins of Martha's house. The structure had collapsed years ago, reclaimed by the water and the trees, but the cypress tree where he'd buried Martha still stood, her name still visible in the bark. He sat beneath it, his back against the trunk, and opened one of his journals. There were dozens of them now, hidden in locations across the South, carefully preserved, a complete record of death and life in post-slavery America. A testament to suffering and survival. "Did I do enough?" he asked the empty air. Asked Martha's ghost if she was listening, asked God if such a thing existed. No answer came. There never was one. He was about to close the journal when he felt it, that familiar sensation, that knowledge that death was near. He raised his hand slowly, watching as his finger extended, and pointed at himself. "Ah," he said softly, "so, it's finally time." He wasn't afraid. If anything, he felt relief. After 55 years of bearing witness, of carrying the weight of so much death, rest seemed like a blessing. But then he heard footsteps. A young woman emerged from the trees, maybe 18 or 19, with dark skin and darker eyes. She moved carefully through the swamp, as if she knew the paths, as if she'd been here before. She stopped when she saw him. "You're him," she said. "The death child. My grandmother told me stories." "Your grandmother?" Josiah asked. "Ruth. She survived the fever at Whitfield Plantation, survived the hanging, told me about a baby who pointed at death." Josiah smiled slightly. "Ruth. I remember her. I'm glad she survived. She said you saved people, said you were cursed, but you used your curse to do good. I tried." The woman came closer, knelt down in front of him. "Are you dying?" "Yes. Now. Soon. Maybe hours. Maybe days." She reached out, took his hand. Her touch was warm, alive. "Then let me stay with you, so you don't die alone." Josiah looked at her, this stranger who'd walked through a swamp to sit with a dying man, and he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Connection. Gratitude. Hope. "What's your name?" he asked. "Dinah," she replied. "My grandmother named me after your mother." Of course she did. The circle was closing, the wheel was turning. Death taking death, as it always did. "Tell me a story," Josiah said. "Something happy. Something that has nothing to do with death or suffering or slavery, just something good." So Dinah did. She told him about her husband, about the farm they were building together, about their plans for children, for a future, about a life lived in freedom, in joy, in hope. And as she talked, as the sun set over the swamp and the stars came out one by one, Josiah felt the weight he'd carried for 55 years finally begin to lift. He died just before dawn, his hand in Dinah's, a smile on his face. His last words were, "Someone needs to find the journals. Someone needs to tell the story." "I will," Dinah promised. "I swear it." They found Josiah's body 3 days later, sitting under the cypress tree, at peace. They buried him next to Martha, under the same ancient tree. Dinah carved his name into the bark, Josiah, 1840 to 1900, he who witnessed. She kept her promise. Over the next year, following clues from his final journal, she located all the others. 23 volumes in total, containing detailed accounts of slavery, the Civil War, Reconstruction, and the birth of Jim Crow. Eyewitness testimony from someone who'd seen it all, who'd recorded not just the deaths, but the lives, the names, the stories, the humanity of people who history would have otherwise forgotten. She donated them to a black church in Richmond, where they were kept safe, copied, and eventually distributed to historians, researchers, and anyone who wanted to understand the truth of that era. Josiah's journals became one of the most important primary sources on black life in 19th century America. They appeared in textbooks, in dissertations, in museum exhibits. His words educated millions long after his death. But more than that, they fulfilled his purpose. They bore witness. They told the truth. They made sure no one was forgotten.